All right. Good morning once again, church family. As you find your seat, if you would open your Bibles to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. And this morning we're going to be in verses 27 to 33. Mark 8, 27 to 33. And the title of the sermon is this: the most important question ever asked. So let's read the text, open us in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into the sermon this morning. Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 27. If you'll follow along in your copy of God's Word, here's what Mark writes. And Jesus went on with the disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." We'll stop right there. You will pray with me. Father, I pray this morning that you would work in all of our souls, that we would have an answer to this question this morning. God, as we look at these two questions that Jesus asked the disciples, as we look at Peter's response, as we look at Jesus' response to Peter, Lord, I pray that you would cause us to sit at your feet, to look up at your face, to have ears that are opened, and to hear the question being asked to us, to our soul individually, that you would cause us to have an answer this morning, God. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm sure there are a lot of questions that you've been asked in your life. Sometimes people say, "What's the best question you've ever been asked?" That's a good question to ask someone. This morning I'm asking a little bit different. What's the most important question you've ever been asked? The most important. There's an objectively right answer to that question. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. The most important question ever asked in the history of the world that's still true today. That's what we're going to look at this morning. So let's look at our text. I'll give exposition of the text, and then I'll give us application after the exposition. So let's start in verse 27, where Mark writes, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, in our previous story, Jesus was in the city of Bethsaida, where he had healed a blind man. And now he's going to travel with the disciples to Caesarea Philippi, which is about 25 miles to the north. So Bethsaida, remember, is on the Sea of Galilee. He's going to travel 25 miles north to Caesarea Philippi, and that's going to be primarily Gentile territory. Once again, he goes to Gentile territory. And we're not told why. We don't know why he's going there. But as they travel, this would be at least a day's journey, maybe two. As they're traveling, Jesus, as a rabbi, which is interesting because normally students ask rabbis questions. That's how it usually worked. But the rabbi asked his students a question. He turns to them and he says, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, why does Jesus ask this question? Is he worried what people think about him? I'll get there in a minute. Look at verse 28. And they told him, John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. So the disciples answer Jesus. They say that, look, some people say that you are John the Baptist raised from the dead. Remember, John's already been killed. So they're saying that John has been raised from the dead, and that's who this is. Remember, that's what Herod thought. Herod thought that Jesus was John raised from the dead. Some say Elijah. Why do they think Elijah? Well, Elijah was one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. And remember, Elijah didn't die. He was taken up to heaven in a chariots of fire. And so they think, well, maybe he's come back since he never died. He's back not from the dead, he's back from heaven. Some said that he was one of the other prophets, like Jeremiah. You know what's interesting is that people have no trouble believing that John rose from the dead, that Jeremiah rose from the dead, that Elijah might have risen from the dead. Just Jesus. They have no problem believing that this man is someone risen from the dead, but when he rises from the dead, they will have trouble believing it. I find that interesting and fascinating. Look at verse 29. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. Now, Jesus is not ultimately interested in what the crowds think. He asked that question, but that's not his main goal here. He wants to know, what do the disciples think? He asked them, but who do you say that I am? Now, the you here is plural, which means he's asking all the disciples, not just one of them, not just two of them. He's asking all of the disciples. Out of all the dozens of recorded questions that Jesus had asked his disciples, this one was the most important. It wasn't the first question. The first question is really not important. There's a strategy here. The second one is the most important question that he ever asked the disciples. You see, I think Jesus asked the disciples the first question to set up the second question. Jesus is being strategic here. He asked the first one to set up the second one. In other words, what Jesus is doing is that he is trying to tell the disciples, he's trying to warn them of the danger of simply following the crowds. In other words, Jesus wants to know. He says, look, who do people say that I am? They have an idea of who others say. That's what the crowds say. And then Jesus wants to ask them, does your faith stop where the crowd's faith stops? That's what he wants to know. Now, even though Jesus asked all 12 of them, Simon Peter speaks up first. Peter answered him. Peter says, you are the Christ. This is the first time that someone uses this term in the Gospel of Mark. What does Christ mean when he says you are the Christ? What does Christ mean? It's not his last name. All right. The Greek word is Christos. That's where we get the word Christ from. The Greek word is Christos. Even though this will later become a name for Jesus, originally it was a title. Notice, Peter calls him the Christ, not just Christ, the Christ. It's a title. It is, here's the definition, a fulfiller of Israelite expectation of a deliverer, the anointed one, Messiah. The Hebrew word Messiah, this is the Greek version of it. Christos, he is the Messiah. Peter is essentially saying, you are the long-awaited Messiah that has been written about in the Hebrew Scriptures. All of these Scriptures that talk about this Messiah coming, you're him. You are him. And Matthew writes that Peter also said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now I want to point out, we all know and remember that Peter was quick to deny Christ. Let's not forget that Peter was also quick to confess Christ. He was the only one who spoke up. He was that we know of, and he was certainly the first one to speak up. He is quick to speak up. You are the Christ. Look at verse 30. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now, in response to Peter's magnificent confession, Jesus strictly charged them, don't tell anybody about this. That seems strange, doesn't it? Jesus telling his disciples, don't tell anyone who I am. Now, this goes against everything that we've been taught in church, isn't it? Jesus, we sing as children growing up, go tell it on the mountain, right? And Jesus is saying, don't go tell it on the mountain. Why? Jesus strictly charged them, tell no one. Now, the word used there, strictly charged, it almost always, 25 out of the 27 times, it means rebuke. It's a very strong word in the Greek that Jesus used here. The Mark uses here. It can also mean to speak seriously, to warn in order to prevent an action. So Jesus is giving Peter and all the disciples as strong a warning as possible. Remember, he had told other people, don't tell them a miracle, and they disobeyed him. But Jesus is letting the disciples know very clearly, do not tell anyone what you just confessed. Don't tell them I'm the Messiah. Now, why? Why does he warn them like this? Jesus knows that if the disciples start spreading the word that Jesus is Israel's Messiah, he might get imprisoned. But he didn't come to get imprisoned. He might get stoned, but he didn't come to get stoned. He might incite a war, but he didn't come to incite wars. Jesus came to die on a cross. And there are a very particular set of circumstances that need to happen in order for him to die on this cross. And so Jesus is being very strategic here. He says, there's coming a day where you can tell the whole world that I'm the Messiah. But right now, don't tell anyone that I'm the Messiah. Look at verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Now, keep in mind, the disciples are all Jews. All 12 of these men are Jews, which means they're steeped in Jewish culture. And we're going to see in a minute that their beliefs about the Messiah, they line up more with their culture than they do with Christ's understanding of the Messiah. You see, they believed, just as all Jews believed at this time, that the Messiah would come onto the scene like a King David. This Messiah would come, and just as David defeated the Philistines, and David gave his people prosperity, David gave his people peace from all their enemies. Solomon's reign there were no wars. It was wealthy and prosperous, and they believe that this Messiah that's been prophesied, he's going to come in and he's going to usher in a new kingdom that is even greater than Solomon's kingdom. He's going to come in, he's going to overthrow the Roman Empire. He's going to overthrow the Herodian dynasty, and he's going to restore us to our Davidic and our Solomonic days. That's what they think. That's what they believe. And so right after Peter makes his confession, right after Peter confesses this, Jesus begins to teach them. And he teaches them about who the Messiah truly is. This is the first of the 3 passion predictions in the Gospel of Mark. He teaches them 4 realities about the Son of Man. Number 1, he says the Messiah, he must suffer many things. You see, the Messiah did not come to subdue, but to suffer. Number 2, he will be rejected by all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. He will be rejected by the very ones that should have received him. Number 3, he will be killed. He did not come to kill. He came to be killed. They expected him to come and put to death the Roman Empire. He's not coming to kill. He's coming to be killed. And 4, after 3 days, he will rise again. Now, how can they process this? How can any of them process this? Imagine waiting your whole life for someone. You finally find them, but they're not who you thought they were. You've waited your whole life. Your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents have waited their whole life for this person. They are finally here. You have them, but they are not who you thought they were. How would you feel? How would you feel? Look at verse 32. And he said this plainly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Jesus said verse 31 plainly. So what he says in verse 31, he says it plainly. Now what does that mean? It means that when Jesus spoke, he normally spoke in parables. He normally spoke in riddles and metaphors, even to the disciples, but not here. He is just plainly speaking. In other words, if it's not as though Jesus used some like parable to describe this. He just flat out said, guys, I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be killed, and I'm going to rise again. And he says that very plainly. No metaphors, no parables, no riddles. Now keep in mind, Peter has just confessed in front of everyone. Peter has just confessed to everyone, you are the Christ. You are Israel's Messiah, come from God. And so when Peter hears this, when he hears that the Messiah is going to suffer and he's going to die, his mind can't process it. He's like, what? So what does he do? It's Jesus, come here. And he rebukes him. He pulls Jesus aside. He pulls the Son of God aside, and he begins to rebuke God. Peter is such an interesting character, isn't he, in the Bible? He's the first and only to walk on water. He is the first to confess that Jesus is the Christ. He is the first to run to the tomb after the resurrection. He is the first to preach a Pentecost sermon. And he is the first and only to pull the Son of God aside and rebuke him. What did Peter say to him? Matthew writes that Peter said, far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you. This is the first of 3 times where Jesus said something would happen and Peter stood up to correct Jesus. The second time is when Jesus said to them, he says, you will all fall away on account of me. And Peter said, they may all fall away, not I. And Jesus said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said, no, I won't. I will never deny you. You see, Paul writes, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews. 1 Corinthians 1:23, Peter was the first to stumble at Christ crucified. He was the first to have that the idea of a Messiah hanging on a cross was a stumbling block to him. He couldn't take it. He couldn't handle it. He couldn't process it. He was the first to stumble over it. Now, the thought of rebuking the Son of God, the thought of taking God aside and rebuking him is terrifying. That's a terrifying thought. How is Jesus going to respond? You know, the fact that Peter exists after this is a testimony to the patience of God. Look at verse 33. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. In response to Peter's rebuke of Jesus, Jesus rebukes Peter. And it's not a gentle rebuke. It's a forceful rebuke. Jesus looks at him and he looks at all the disciples and says in front of them, right? It's funny because Peter took Jesus aside. So they kind of have this private conversation, but then Jesus turns and looks at the disciples, meaning he wants everybody to hear this. He is not going to give this rebuke in private to Peter. He wants everybody to hear this. And he looks at the disciples and he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Wow. Wow. It's not every day that Jesus equates someone's words with the words of Satan. Why did Jesus say this to Peter? Why did he say this to Peter? Well, I'll give you my best guess or thoughts here. Remember the temptations in the desert when Jesus went into the desert and then Satan came to tempt him? What was Satan tempting Jesus to do in the desert? Essentially, like, if I had to put it, there were three temptations, but if we had to roll all three of those into one, what was Satan tempting Jesus to do in all of those? I think it's this: essentially to act like a human king. Essentially to act like a human king. You see, human kings do not consult with anybody. They do whatever they please. They want to eat, they eat. A king does not ask for permission to eat. But Jesus will not turn stones into bread independently of his Father. He will not do it. Human kings do not fear anything, not even jumping off of a temple. Satan tries to tempt him and says, if you are God, jump off the temple. They'll save you. The angels will save you. See, human kings want to flaunt their power and their prestige. They want everyone to know how powerful they are. They want everyone to know their prestige. But Jesus did not come to publicly display his power and his prestige. It's not why he came. Human kings always want immediate glory. It's a glory grab. They always want as much glory as possible immediately. But Jesus was not willing to take the easy path to glory. He will not bow down to Satan to take the easy path to glory. His path will be marked by suffering. You see, Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan, because Peter's motivations are the same motivations as Satan's. Peter wants Jesus to operate like a human king, just as Satan does. An earthly Messiah. But Jesus tells Peter, he says, Peter, you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. You are thinking about the Messiah the way men think about the Messiah, not like God thinks about the Messiah. Jesus is challenging Peter's thinking. He says, don't think the way man thinks. Think the way God thinks. And I'll stop there with our exposition. Application. Application of the text. I have 6 points. 6 points of application. Number 1, there will always be multiple opinions on who Jesus was, and it's important to know what people think. There will always be multiple opinions on who Jesus was, who Jesus is, and it's important to know what people think. See, Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? And the disciples respond with many things. We've heard a lot of opinions. Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say one of the prophets, like Jeremiah. Why did Jesus ask this question? Why did he ask the disciples, who do people say that I am? Jesus isn't worried about being popular. He doesn't care what people think about him the way that we do. Why did he ask them this question? I like what Leon Morris has to write. Here's what he says. The 2 stages of the question required the disciples to form and express their own judgment about Jesus rather than merely seconding the views of others. They must separate themselves from the majority opinion and risk a personal confession. You see, in our world today, it's kind of like similar to know, are you doing this because people on TikTok do this? Or do you have your own opinion? Do you have your own ideas? Jesus wants to know, have you formulated your own opinion of me? What this means is that before we form our own beliefs, before any of us can decide on who we think Jesus is, we have to first know what are the opinions of others as well. For 2 reasons. Number 1, a personal faith reason, and number 2, an apologetic reason. Number 1, a personal faith reason. Before we can definitively say that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, we must know, what do others say? Because we don't believe blindly, right? It's not as though if people say, well, Matt, why do you believe Jesus is the Christ? It's not as like, well, I read my Bible, I formulated an opinion, and then anytime that somebody tries to tell me otherwise, I just earmuff. No. Our faith is not in a bubble. We don't believe this in a bubble. Faith is hearing, what do other people say? What do the crowd say? What do your parents say? What do your grandparents say? What do your aunts and uncles, your brothers and your sisters, your sons and your daughters? What does your boss, what do others say about who Jesus is? And knowing that, and yet still believing that he is the Christ. That is faith. Faith must be tested. 2, there's an apologetic reason. In other words, when we go out into public and share the gospel, it's important to know what people think, right? You go out into the public and you want to share the gospel, right? You need to know not only what you think, but what do other people think, right? Because when you go out, some will say, well, you know, Jesus is just a Jewish religious figure. That's all he was. Some will say, well, he was a prophet, kind of like Muhammad. You know, Jesus, Muhammad, same thing. Some will say, oh, he's the leader of the Christian movement. Some will say he's just another dead white guy. It's always found funny because he's not white. There will always be multiple opinions on who Jesus was. And it's important to know what people think, both for ourselves and for sharing the gospel. Number 2, believing that Jesus is a prophet, period, is no different than believing Jesus is a phony. Believing that Jesus is a prophet, period, is no different than believing Jesus is a phony. Several years ago, there was this very small movement. I don't even know if it's still going on. Maybe it is. But there was a small movement that was going on in the area called Jesus is blank. You may have seen that. You may have seen like billboards or T-shirts, or there was a book written about it. There was a website where people could input their answers on it. When it first came out, I would go to the website and I would read the responses. I won't read the heretical and blasphemous ones. There were a lot of heretical and blasphemous ones. But let me give you some of the religious ones. Some of the responses were, Jesus is my homeboy. Jesus is my GPS. Jesus is relevant. Jesus is my friend. Jesus is compassionate. Now, here's the thing. All of those are true in some measure. All of those are true in some measure. Here's the danger. A half-truth or a partial truth is often more dangerous than error itself. There are many people who will go to hell believing a half-truth. When Jesus asked, who do people say that I am? Did you notice that the crowds didn't dismiss him as crazy as his family did? His family thought he was out of his mind. But these crowds, they didn't dismiss him as crazy. Did you notice they didn't dismiss him as demon-possessed, as the Pharisees did? They attributed high status to Jesus. Not low status, high. High status. They said, we think he's John the Baptist, a great prophet. We think he is Elijah. We think that he is maybe Jeremiah. They attributed high status to Jesus. But let me ask you a question. What is the difference between believing Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead and believing Jesus is demon-possessed? Let me say it again. What is the difference between believing Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead and believing Jesus is demon-possessed? What's the difference? Eternally speaking, nothing. Nothing. They will both send a person to hell. You see, the problem with believing that Jesus is my homeboy or my GPS or my friend or compassion is that if that is all that Jesus is to us, then Jesus is nothing to us. Believing that Jesus is a prophet, period, or a really good moral teacher and a good figure to follow and a good example for our children, if that is all that he is nothing to us. It's no different than believing he's a phony. 3, the most important question we will ever be asked is this: who do you say that I am? The most important question we will ever be asked is, who do you say that I am? Jesus is looking directly at you and at me this morning. Right now, through the preaching of the word, I'm not at all saying I'm Jesus, but I'm his representative. Jesus is looking directly at you and at me this morning, and he is asking every one of us this question, and it is the most important question you will ever be asked. Who do you say that I am? I like how the NIV translates it, because they actually bring out the emphatic in the Greek. The ESV doesn't bring out the emphatic. Emphatic means that in the Greek, you don't have to add the pronoun. The verb can carry the pronoun. But when you want to make it emphatic, you add the pronoun, and they do. The Greek adds the pronoun. So the NIV brings us out. Here's how the NIV translates it. But what about you? Who do you say that I am? Jesus, in other words, he's saying, who do the crowd say? They tell him, and he says, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? You see, it's not who do my parents say that Jesus is. It's not who does my pastor say that Jesus is. It's not who does my church say that Jesus is. It's not who does my spouse say that Jesus is. It's not who does American Christianity say that Jesus is. It is this: what about you? Singular. Who do you say that Jesus is? You know, as a pastor, I have to ask this question a lot because, part of membership or part of just getting to know somebody, I'll ask them, right? I'll have to ask them some variation of this question: who is Jesus? Do you know what is my favorite response to that question? Like, hands down, nothing comes close to it. Do you know what is my favorite response to the question of who is Jesus? When a person just smiles. They just smile. You see, the temptation is to go into academic mode. You begin to think about, oh my gosh, what's the correct answer? We go into school mode. What's the correct answer? I love it when I ask that question, and before they give their answer, they just smile. There are a plethora of questions we'll be asked in our life. Plethora. Important questions. Important questions. What college do you want to go to? Moses, what college do you want to go to? What career path do you want to take? Who am I going to marry? Will you marry me? When should we have kids? How many should we have? What church should I attend? When should I retire? How much money do I need to save up? These are all important questions. Brothers and sisters, these are all important questions, but none of them come close to this question's importance. Who do you say that Jesus is? Because your eternity hangs on that question and that answer. And it doesn't hang as to whether you get it academically right. Satan gets that question academically right. Who do you say that he is? Four. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Matthew 16:17. This is not recorded in Mark, but I included it because I love the statement that Jesus says to Peter after he confesses it. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. When Jesus says to all the disciples, but what about you, plural? Who do you, plural, say that I am? Simon Peter, singular, speaks up, and reading from Matthew, he says this, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Have you ever considered what a miracle it is that we believe that Jesus is the Christ? Have you ever considered what a miracle it is that we believe He's the Messiah? He is the Son of the living God. It is an absolute miracle. You see, we live in a time of great suspicion, right? Probably for good reason. We've been lied to over and over again from both sides of the aisle. And it's created a great mistrust in our society, has it not? I don't know about you, but for me, I'll just speak for myself. There are very few things that if I read online, that my first thought isn't, is that true? Is that all the facts? Is there more to this story? Are you skewing the statistics? Right? I don't read almost anything online, and that's not my first thought. There's got to be more to the story. You're skewing the statistics. Is that true? Right? We've been lied to so much that we have a great suspicion. This thinking has deeply entrenched in our minds, many people's minds. And so, what a miracle it is that when I read this word, still today, at the age of 42, after being saved for 21 years, that when I read this word, when I hear this word preached, when I sit alone in my study and I meditate on this word, I believe it. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I believe He's the Christ with no doubt, no suspicion, no second guessing. I believe it as much as I believe that I exist. I believe it. It's a miracle. It's a miracle that anybody believes this morning. Brother and sister, if you believe He's the Christ and the Son of the, it is a miracle that you believe this. Jesus says it's a miracle. He says to Simon, He says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. Meaning not your parents, not your pastor, not a book, not society, but my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. It is a miracle that any of us believe this. Christian, have you ever considered how blessed you are? How blessed you are that you believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He is the Son of the living God. 5, we all struggle with the tension of who we want Jesus to be and who Jesus actually is. We all struggle with the tension of who we want Jesus to be and who Jesus actually is. I love the tension in these two stories because in the first story, Jesus asked them, He says, who do you say that I am? Right? Very simple question. And Peter makes this glorious confession. He says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Peter gets it, right? We walk away and we're like, he gets it. He understands. He knows who Jesus is. But then right after his confession, Jesus begins talking about His suffering, His rejection, His death, and His resurrection. And Peter pulls him aside and he begins to rebuke him. Meaning, he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand who Jesus is. Peter understands that Jesus is the promised Messiah, but he has a different definition of Messiah. A different definition. Peter understands the Messiah to be a political liberator. He thinks the Messiah is a political liberator. That's why at the end of Jesus' ministry, He's chopping off guys' ears. Because he doesn't understand. We all struggle with this tension of who we want Jesus to be and who He actually is. Like when we say that Jesus is compassionate, and He is, but when we say that, we all have a preconceived idea of what that means and how Jesus should act. We all have a preconceived idea of that. When we say that Jesus is holy, which he is, we all have a preconceived idea of what that means and how Jesus should act, how he should operate. This goes for all of his attributes: love, omnipotence, just, good, righteous, humble. You say, what's the point of this? Here's the point of this. At small group this past week, I was listening to a sermon. I was after small group. Not during small group. At small group this past week, while we were all together, I was listening to a sermon, a heretical sermon, from a local church here in King County. And I realized how dangerous it is when we take who we want Jesus to be, and then we make that to be who Jesus is. Let me say it again. It is dangerous when we take who we want Jesus to be, and then we make that who Jesus is. That's what this sermon was doing. You know, we want Jesus to be affirming, understanding, embracing. We want him to be powerful, dogmatic, whatever the case is. Be careful. We all struggle with this tension, all of us. We all struggle with the tension of who we want Jesus to be and who he actually is. We must not, like Peter, be steeped in our culture, even Christian culture, even our church's culture of who we've always heard Jesus to be, and then say that's who he is. No, what do we need to do? We need to go to the source. Go to the Word of God and ask myself, when I read this, who is Jesus? Who is he? I need to discover who he is. It's so important that we go to his Word. Number 6, last point. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Colossians 3:2. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Colossians 3:2. At our retreat last year, we go on a retreat every year. We went on one this past August. And at our retreat last year, I gave the people at the retreat a fellowship exercise where they were to ask, we all got in a group and we would ask each other pre-populated questions that I had given. And one of the questions was this: if you could be any character in the Bible, who would you want to be? 2 or more people said Simon Peter. While I can largely relate to that answer, I really can largely relate to that answer, not here. It's not every day that the Son of God turns and looks at you and says, "Get behind me, Satan." I do not want to be Peter here. Jesus tells Peter, you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Now, Paul takes Jesus' statement and he uses it in the positive. Paul says, set your minds on things that are above, on the things that are of God, not on the things of earth, the things of man. Now, what does it look like to do this? What does it look like to set our minds on things above, not on the things of earth? We're going to get to that next week. Jesus will tell us next week in the next paragraph, so I'll wait for that. But as a preview, Jesus is telling the disciples, because they have this idea of what his mission is, and Jesus is clearly telling them, plainly telling them, guys, my mission is to die. My purpose is to die. Now, here's the thing. So is yours. So is yours. Our mission is to die. Our purpose is to die. We were born to die. You see, everything in this life is calling us to live it up. Live up your life. Be your true self. Be true to yourself. Live it up. Live your life. And yet, our Savior is calling us to die. Deny self. Take up your cross. Friend, don't trade a lifetime of prosperity for an eternity of suffering. Take up a lifetime of suffering to inherit an eternity of prosperity. Set your minds on things above, not on things of this earth.